The sharp crack of a gunshot tore through the quiet afternoon. Anthony Marshall, a tall black man, froze in the middle of the asphalt, his face twisted in shock and pain. He staggered back, clutching his stomach where blood quickly soaked his shirt and spilled onto the pavement. In his other hand, he still loosely held the phone he had just pulled from his pocket. His wide, questioning eyes locked onto the white police officer standing a few steps away. Then his strength gave out, and he collapsed silently to the ground, gasping for air. Officer Scott Harrington stood frozen, his Glock 19 still raised, smoke drifting from the barrel. His face was a mess of lingering anger, twisted satisfaction, and creeping panic. He knew he'd shot someone, but he hadn't yet grasped the magnitude of what he had done. Sorry to interrupt the story. Before we continue, we'd really appreciate it if you could like the video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us get closer to 1,000 subscribers. It means the world to us. Thank you so much. Just an hour earlier, Anthony Marshall's black Lexus ES 350 cruised smoothly toward Oakmont. Inside, the cool air conditioning contrasted with the warm autumn sun. Anthony, 50, had just finished a grueling week at the Pentagon. A respected lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Army, he had built a career of quiet excellence and leadership. But today he was simply a son visiting his aging mother, Martha, who lived alone in Summit Ridge Estates after her husband's death. Anthony had promised to bring her favorite strawberry shortcake from a nearby bakery. Smiling at the thought, he played a classic jazz CD, letting the music soothe him after his flight from Washington, D.C. Turning onto the private roads of Summit Ridge, he admired the pristine mansions and quiet streets, slowing carefully to respect the 25 speed limit. Unbeknownst to Anthony, his presence in the wealthy, all-white neighborhood drew the attention of Officer Harrington, patrolling nearby. Harrington, a man in his 40s harboring deep racial prejudice, saw Anthony's Lexus and immediately assumed trouble. Without any cause, Harrington muttered suspicions of drug dealing or theft and decided to act. He whipped his patrol car around, flipped on the red and blue lights, and sped after Anthony. Seeing the flashing lights in his rearview mirror, Anthony sighed, annoyed but calm, unaware that a simple traffic stop would soon turn into tragedy. Anthony Marshall knew he hadn't been speeding or doing anything wrong. Maybe it was just a random check, or maybe the out-of-state plates had caught the officer's attention. Either way, he followed procedure calmly. He signaled right, slowed down, and pulled over neatly under a large maple tree, its leaves blazing orange. He turned off the engine, cracked the window halfway, and placed his hands visibly on the steering wheel, at 10 and 2 standard to show compliance. Officer Harrington stopped a few meters behind the Lexus but slammed his door aggressively as he got out. His right hand stayed near his gun, his steps slow and arrogant, his gaze filled with suspicion and barely hidden envy as he approached. Without any greeting or explanation, Harrington barked, license and registration, his tone harsh and dismissive. Though Anthony sensed the disrespect, he remained calm. "Hello, officer. Is there a problem? Did I do something wrong?" he asked politely. Harrington didn't answer. Instead, he scanned Anthony from head to toe, his voice dripping with contempt. "The point is, you're here. What the hell are you doing in Summit Ridge Estates? This isn't your place. Give me your papers quick." Anthony felt anger rising but controlled it. Military discipline ran deep in his blood. He breathed deeply, reached slowly into the glove box, and handed over his license, registration, and insurance. "I'm visiting my mother, officer," he said steadily. "She lives on Oak Lane." Harrington snatched the documents, flipping through them roughly. Seeing Anthony's Virginia address, he sneered, "Virginia, huh? Pretty far. Visiting mom or casing houses for your friends?" His ugly smile showed open contempt. At that moment, Anthony's patience snapped. His voice turned cold and firm. "Officer, your behavior is unacceptable. You are abusing your authority and discriminating against me. I have done nothing wrong. I demand you let me go immediately." His commanding tone, shaped by years of military leadership, only enraged Harrington further. "You dare order me around?" Harrington barked, his face flushing with anger. "Get out of the car. Now. I want to check for drugs or weapons." He pounded the window with his hand, making threatening noises. Anthony stared straight into Harrington's furious eyes and realized the situation was spiraling. Staying inside could be seen as defiance and might trigger even worse violence. Quickly deciding to diffuse the tension, Anthony calmly turned off the engine, unbuckled his seatbelt, and slowly opened the door, ready to face the situation head-on. Anthony Marshall stepped out, standing tall beside his black Lexus, facing Officer Harrington directly. His voice was calm, steady. "I'm out of the car, officer. Now what?" But instead of easing the situation, Anthony's composed exit only fueled Harrington's aggression. Harrington stepped closer, invading Anthony's space, hurling insults laced with open hatred. "Get out of here. You don't belong. This is a neighborhood for decent white people, not your kind." The blatant racism made Anthony realize reasoning was useless. Harrington's abuse of power had crossed every line. Anthony stared Harrington down, his voice cold and firm. "Officer, your behavior is illegal. I will record this conversation and call my attorney right now." He calmly reached inside his jacket for his phone, a deliberate, slow movement, non-threatening. But Harrington, consumed by rage and prejudice, exploded. "What are you doing? Draw your weapon." "Stop," he shouted in panic. Before Anthony could even pull out his phone, Harrington reacted without thinking. Without warning, he yanked out his Glock 19 and fired. The 9mm bullet tore through Anthony's abdomen. Staggering backward, Anthony crashed against the Lexus, his face a mask of shock and agony. He clutched his bleeding stomach, but his legs gave out. He dropped to his knees, then collapsed fully onto the sun-warmed asphalt. His phone slipped from his hand, landing beside the pool of blood spreading under him. With one final weak breath, Lieutenant Colonel Anthony Marshall, a decorated officer, a devoted son, died unjustly on the streets of the country he had served. Officer Scott Harrington stood frozen, his gun still raised, the barrel smoking faintly. The anger drained from his face, replaced by hollow panic. He knew he had crossed a line, but he couldn't yet grasp the full storm about to descend. The gunshot shattered the peace of Summit Ridge Estates. Curtains twitched, alarmed faces peered out. Within a minute, several 911 calls flooded in, reporting a man down next to a black Lexus, with a police cruiser parked nearby. Harrington, rattled and panicked, raised his radio with shaking hands, trying to sound professional. 7 a.m. 2 to dispatch, shots fired, Willow Lane and Summit Drive. Subject was hostile, non-compliant, reached for what looked like a weapon. I was forced to fire in self-defense. But no lie could contain the truth that was already racing toward him. Officer Harrington, heart pounding, hastily radioed for an ambulance and level 3 backup. Ending the call, he stared at Anthony Marshall's lifeless body in the black cell phone nearby, desperately building a false narrative in his mind. He told himself the man had resisted, pulled something that looked like a gun, and he, Harrington, had acted in self-defense, even though a small voice inside him screamed it was a lie. Within minutes, sirens blared from every direction. 2 more patrol cars and an Oakmont Fire Department ambulance arrived, red and blue lights flashing against the twilight. Officers cautiously stepped out, guns drawn, quickly assessing the scene. A black man lying in a spreading pool of blood next to a luxury Lexus, and Harrington leaning against his cruiser, pale and trembling. Sergeant Victor Morales, the shift commander, rushed over. "What the hell happened, Dan?" he demanded. Harrington, sticking to his false story, stammered. He resisted. He pulled something from his jacket. "I had no choice." Harrington avoided Morales' sharp gaze. While Morales coordinated securing the scene, paramedics worked frantically over Anthony, finding almost no pulse. Despite aggressive chest compressions, bleeding control, and intubation, survival seemed unlikely. They loaded him onto a stretcher and rushed him into the ambulance. Following protocol for an officer-involved shooting, Morales began collecting evidence. Nearby, an officer retrieved the black phone soaked in blood. Morales, wearing gloves, checked Anthony's pockets. From the back pocket, he found a thick brown wallet. Under the flashlight, he saw a few bills, credit cards bearing the name Anthony Marshall, and old family photos. But it was the ID beneath the driver's license that froze Morales. A U.S. military ID card, Lieutenant Colonel, U.S. Army Department of Defense, Pentagon. Morales' heart sank. A wave of dread swept through him. This wasn't just another police shooting. This was the killing of an active high-ranking military officer. Morales immediately stepped away from Harrington and the others, switching his radio to a secure command channel. His voice was low, urgent, requesting direct contact with Chief David Miller. He reported the shooting, the victim's critical status, and most importantly, the devastating fact that the man Harrington shot was a lieutenant colonel at the Pentagon. Even from a distance, Harrington noticed the sudden tension. Though he couldn't hear clearly, words like lieutenant colonel and Pentagon echoed ominously. A cold sweat broke out across his forehead and down his back. His confusion gave way to pure terror. He realized the nightmare he had unleashed was far beyond anything he could control. Officer Harrington's legs shook uncontrollably. He hadn't just killed a man, he had killed someone whose death would unleash massive political outrage. His life and career were over. All he could hope for now was to avoid the worst. The ambulance raced toward Oakmont Medical Center, siren blaring. Inside, medical teams fought desperately to save Lieutenant Colonel Anthony Marshall, but the bullet had caused fatal internal damage. Despite hours of emergency surgery by the best surgeons, all efforts failed. At 9:17 p.m. Anthony Marshall was pronounced dead on the operating table, far from his family and his unit, ending a life of service in a single senseless, prejudiced act of violence. News of his death spread rapidly, first through military and government channels, then far beyond Oakmont. Within hours, it reached the Pentagon in Arlington, Virginia. The confirmation of Lieutenant Colonel Marshall's death sent shock, grief, and unprecedented fury through the highest ranks of the military. Marshall wasn't just another officer, he was deeply respected, a mentor and a symbol of Army values, discipline, honor, and courage. His brutal killing, clearly linked to racial profiling, was seen as a grave insult to him, his family, and the military itself. In his office overlooking the Potomac River, General Henry Stafford, Vice Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army, received the news. His usually calm demeanor shattered, rage burned in his blue eyes. Slamming the phone down, he roared, "Unbelievable. Unacceptable." He paced furiously, fists clenched. Anthony gunned down like an animal because he was black, in the country he swore to defend. We cannot let this go. General Stafford's fury quickly ignited across the Pentagon. Emergency meetings were called. The decision was clear: while the Pentagon would not interfere directly with the criminal investigation that remained with the civilian system, they would exert every political, legal, and institutional pressure to ensure full, swift, and severe justice. That night, General Stafford personally called the state's governor, expressing the Department of Defense's grave concern. Other senior generals made similar urgent calls to the mayor of Oakmont, as well as state senators and representatives. Their message was unmistakable: the military was watching and they would not allow this injustice to be buried. The Pentagon demanded a transparent and fair investigation. A formal letter was sent to the U.S. Department of Justice requesting the FBI's Civil Rights Division to investigate possible federal violations. The unspoken message was clear: the Pentagon was watching closely and would not tolerate any injustice. The pressure quickly reached Oakmont. Sheriff David Miller and District Attorney Emma Romano faced nonstop calls from the governor's office, senators, aides, and even generals. Sheriff Miller, an experienced and politically sharp man, knew there could be no cover-up. He ordered Internal Affairs, IA, to prioritize the investigation into Officer Harrington with absolute transparency. Under Pentagon pressure, he also agreed to allow the Army's Criminal Investigation Command, CID, access to the files as official observers, an extraordinary move that showed the seriousness of the case. The IA investigation soon dismantled Harrington's self-defense claim. The victim's cell phone was recovered, no weapon was found. The autopsy confirmed a close-range shot to the abdomen with no signs of struggle. Harrington's body cam had been turned off just before the shooting, a major violation. Witnesses across the street testified they only heard Harrington shouting, followed by gunfire, no resistance from the victim. Faced with undeniable evidence and intense political pressure, District Attorney Emma Romano, a sharp and ambitious prosecutor, recognized the weight of the case. It was about justice and her career. After gathering enough evidence, she held a major press conference. Standing firm before the national media, she announced, "After careful review, the Oakmont County District Attorney's Office has decided to charge Officer Scott Harrington with first-degree murder in the death of Lieutenant Colonel Anthony Marshall. We believe his actions were willful, premeditated, and motivated by hate. We will also consider seeking the death penalty." The announcement shocked the nation but earned overwhelming public and military support. The legal battle officially began amid a media storm. Meanwhile, Monica Marshall, Anthony's widow, emerged as a dignified symbol of grief and justice. Flying from Virginia with her 2 adult children, she attended a solemn memorial service crowded with city, state, and military leaders. Dressed simply in black, she delivered a short but moving speech, her voice choked but firm, speaking of her husband, a brave soldier, a loving father, and a man of honor. Monica Marshall stood firm before the crowd. Anthony was a loving father, loyal partner, and model citizen, she said, her voice steady. He believed in justice, honor, and equality, and he fought for those values around the world. Yet, in the end, hatred and prejudice took his life here at home. We are not seeking revenge, we seek justice, so his death will not be in vain. Her speech quickly went viral, inspiring deep sympathy, especially from the military and veterans communities. Major veterans groups, activists, and civil rights organizations rallied in support, holding vigils, raising legal funds, and demanding the harshest punishment for Scott Harrington. The tragedy of Lieutenant Colonel Marshall became a national call for change. Months later, Officer Harrington's first-degree murder trial began at Oakmont County Superior Court, drawing national and international attention. Security was tight, courtroom seats were filled with reporters, activists, and citizens. Monica Marshall, her children, and senior military officers, including General Henry Stafford, sat in the front rows, silently reminding the court of who Anthony was. District Attorney Emma Romano personally led the prosecution, presenting a clear, powerful case. They reconstructed the entire incident: Harrington's unjustified stop, racist insults, and the fatal shooting as Anthony tried to retrieve his phone. Romano held up Anthony's blood-stained cell phone to the jury. This is the weapon Harrington feared, a phone Anthony intended to use to protect his rights. For this, he paid with his life. Forensic experts proved the shooting was unnecessary and violated police protocol. Witnesses confirmed there was no struggle before Harrington fired. Past complaints about Harrington's discriminatory behavior were also revealed, showing a pattern of misconduct. Reluctant police witnesses admitted under oath that Harrington panicked, lied, and there was no sign of a threat at the scene. The most emotional moment came when Monica Marshall testified. She spoke of her 30 years of marriage, her husband's sacrifices, and the devastating loss. Calm but heartbroken, she asked the jury, "Please give my husband justice." Her words moved many to tears, including some jurors. The defense tried to portray Harrington as a stressed officer who acted in fear for his life. They pointed to Anthony's hand movement and tried to downplay the racial slurs as a heated moment. They called colleagues to vouch for Harrington's character. But against overwhelming evidence and credible testimony, their arguments seemed weak and unconvincing. Despite the defense's efforts, the overwhelming evidence, the victim's unique status, and the nationwide outrage made their arguments weak and unconvincing. Claiming a momentary misunderstanding could not justify Harrington's unlawful stop, sustained insults, and fatal shooting. After weeks of intense trial, hundreds of exhibits, and dozens of witnesses, both sides delivered powerful closing arguments. The 12 jurors, 7 women and 5 men, racially diverse, retired to deliberate. The entire nation waited in suspense. After 2.5 days, word came: the jury had reached a verdict. The courtroom filled with heavy tension as the jurors filed in. Scott Harrington sat pale and trembling. Monica Marshall gripped her children's hands tightly. The judge asked the forewoman if a unanimous verdict had been reached. "Yes, Your Honor," she replied. On the charge of first-degree murder, the jury found Scott Harrington guilty. A collective gasp filled the room. Harrington collapsed into his chair, his face buried in his hands. Monica Marshall quietly wept, her long-held pain finally released. Military officers remained composed, but their silent relief was clear. Justice had been served. The trial moved to the sentencing phase. Harrington faced either life imprisonment without parole or the death penalty. District Attorney Emma Romano argued forcefully for the death penalty, citing the brutality of the crime, the racial motive, the abuse of power, and the betrayal of public trust. She reminded the court that the victim, a decorated military officer, was murdered while defenseless. Justice demands the ultimate sentence, she concluded. The defense pleaded for mercy, citing Harrington's troubled childhood, his years of service, and potential for reform. They begged for a life sentence instead of death. After carefully reviewing the arguments, the evidence, and the law, the presiding judge, a fair but firm elder, asked Harrington to stand. Harrington rose shakily, pale and hollow-eyed. The judge's voice was solemn and unwavering. Harrington's actions were cruel, unjustifiable, and driven by blind hatred. The judge stated that prejudice had driven Harrington's actions, leading to an irreversible tragedy, and that the crime demanded the harshest penalty under the law to affirm the value of the life lost and deter future injustice. He took a breath, looked at Scott Harrington, and declared, "The court sentenced Scott Harrington to death." The courtroom froze. A death sentence for a police officer was almost unheard of in the state and extremely rare across the U.S. Harrington let out a desperate, broken scream before collapsing, dragged away by security guards. Monica Marshall cried on her son's shoulder, tears not just of grief but of relief. Justice, though delayed and painful, had finally been served at the highest level. News of Harrington's sentence spread globally within minutes, dominating headlines. Supporters of the Marshall family, the military, and civil rights groups celebrated it as historic justice, while death penalty opponents and some police unions condemned it as excessive and politically pressured. At the Pentagon, General Henry Stafford held a press conference. Standing solemnly before the American and Army flags, he declared, "Today, justice has been served for Lieutenant Colonel Anthony Marshall, a brave soldier, a beloved son of the United States Army. This verdict sends a clear message: no one is above the law, and we will always stand for our soldiers." However, Stafford admitted that no verdict could bring Anthony back. He pledged the Army would continue fighting racism and injustice both within its ranks and beyond, striving for a society where all are treated with dignity. In a brief statement, Monica Marshall expressed deep gratitude to the DA, the jury, the judge, and all who supported her family. "No sentence can heal our wounds," she wrote. "But we hope today's justice will inspire real change, so that no other family will suffer as ours has." 1 week after the verdict, the echoes of the trial still reverberated across the nation. In Oakmont, the courthouse was quiet again, but the weight of what had happened lingered heavily in the air. Memorials for Lieutenant Colonel Anthony Marshall continued to grow, with flowers, flags, and handwritten notes filling the steps of the local courthouse and his mother's front yard. In Washington, D.C., military leaders, civil rights advocates, and lawmakers gathered in small but powerful meetings, drafting early outlines for new reforms aimed at ending racial profiling and abuse of authority in law enforcement. The name Anthony Marshall had become more than a headline. It had become a rallying cry for dignity, accountability, and change. Monica Marshall, still grieving, channeled her pain into action. She announced the creation of the Anthony A. Marshall Foundation, dedicated to promoting justice, supporting military families, and educating future generations about equality. Her calm, unwavering presence in interviews reminded the nation that healing after injustice requires not just anger, but vision and purpose. As for Scott Harrington, he remained isolated in a maximum security prison, awaiting the long appeals process that would unfold over years. But in the public consciousness, his fate was already sealed, a stark reminder of what happens when hatred is allowed to replace humanity. 1 week later, the pain was still raw. But alongside the sorrow, something else was growing: a quiet, unstoppable determination to honor a life by ensuring his sacrifice would never be forgotten. 1 month later, the story of Anthony Marshall had not faded. Across the country, his name was still spoken with respect, sorrow, and a deep sense of unfinished duty. Candlelight vigils continued to light up city parks, college campuses, and military bases. Portraits of him, stoic, dignified, strong, appeared in murals, on banners, and in public service announcements calling for justice reform. The Anthony A. Marshall Foundation had grown rapidly, receiving overwhelming support from veterans, civil rights groups, and ordinary citizens who saw in his story a reflection of their own longings for a better, fairer America. Scholarships were launched in his name, aimed at young black students dreaming of serving their country with pride, just as Anthony had. In the halls of Congress, legislators introduced the Marshall Civil Rights Act, a sweeping bill aimed at curbing racial bias in policing, mandating transparency, and reinforcing accountability measures nationwide. Though still facing debate and resistance, its very existence was proof of a shifting tide. Monica Marshall, standing quietly at the front lines of this movement, continued to lead not with anger, but with unwavering dignity. In speeches and interviews, she reminded the world that justice is not a moment, it is a journey built step by step, day by day, by ordinary people refusing to give up. 1 month later, the pain remained, but so did the hope. And with every name spoken, Every candle lit, every vow to do better, Anthony Marshall's legacy grew stronger, no longer just a memory, but a living force for change. Note: this story is entirely fictional and created for the purpose of raising awareness. It highlights issues of responsibility, justice, and the importance of treating everyone with respect and dignity. We firmly oppose violence, prejudice, and injustice in all forms. Viewer discretion is advised.